Welcome back, brothers, to this session of our Fishers of Men here at St. Anne's in Bartlett. And also for our sisters also who will be listening and watching also. This is part 4 of a 5-part series entitled, What in the World is the Bible? And I've been trying to expand our awareness of what we're dealing with. Because I think in our time we've become very narrow. And also I wanted to explore, what did Jesus and the apostles realize? What were their perceptions? And so expanding our perception is going to take us on an interesting journey this morning. Just to give a recap, first of all, we talked about the Bible is not just a book. Remember, the first thing we did was the Bible is a place of encounter. The second part we did was the Bible is a covenant. It's a relationship. Hence, we had the Old Testament and New Testament. I explained the history of these words. And then we looked at Scripture as a reflection of the face of God. And the last one I did was especially looking at the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It is a model of creation, a model of the universe. And I happen to mention that a contemporary of Jesus and the apostles was the famous Jewish philosopher Philo Judaeus of Alexandria. And in his book, The Life of Moses, he said that the last chapter of Exodus, chapter 40, that when Moses began to set up the tabernacle in the wilderness, to put it all together, it patterned the 6 days of creation. And so hence the very temple itself was a model of our universe. Hence Jesus will say in John chapter 2, destroy this temple, in 3 days I raise it up. It's a prophecy. The book of Exodus is a prophecy. It's about the incarnation. It's the body of Christ, the one through whom all things were made. Now, what I want to explore with you this morning, since I mentioned creation, is that many people, even devout Christians, have a problem. And it's a problem that I don't think existed for Jesus and the apostles, but it does seem to exist for our time. And that is, people have instituted some type of a conflict between science and Scripture, between faith and reason. And it's gotten to be a very difficult problem. And we're going to explore not the problem, but what is the right perception. Now, this comes as a shock to many people, but the Catholic Church does have a dogma. And it had to be formulated during the First Vatican Council in 1870, something that it had taken for granted for centuries, but because of people inventing conflicts, a definite definition had to be made. And it is a dogma of the Catholic Church that there is not a conflict between faith and reason. Now, how many people get into and invent problems, especially when it talks about the universe and creation, correct? Well, remember something. God can only talk to us in a language that we're able to perceive. And that idea of language is going to take us somewhere this morning. To open us up, to open up our imagination to what in the world is the Bible. Ultimately, when we do this last session next week, we're going to discover that the Bible's just not only not a book. We will begin to discover that the Bible is actually, it's a person. A person, Jesus Christ. And I'm going to introduce that right now. To begin with, there are people who are physicists, astrophysicists, nuclear physicists, who claim that God does not exist, that Scripture is nonsense. And there's one in particular at Caltech named Sean Carroll who's like that. But what people don't realize are some of the great scientists who are devout Christians and Jews. I've got a list of 9 Nobel Prize laureates in physics, chemistry, and biomedical physics. Nobel Prize winners who not only believe in God and are devout to the scripture, but have said that even one person knows about a conversion that happened because of the research. One in particular was the person who discovered the human genome. There's an amazing person who is a nuclear physicist. He's one of the general directors of an institute in Switzerland called CERN. That's the famous collider that's there. This guy's the one, I think, who flips on the switch to turn it on. He's a devout Catholic, Luciano Rossi. He talked about his explorations, made him realize just how gratuitous this universe is. There's no reason for it to exist. But somebody has to be a giver. And most recently, there is an interesting person, and you've seen him on television a lot. He's a Japanese American, the child of also Japanese Americans, and his name is Michio Kaku. Famous physicist, works on string theory. All these things you hear about, he tries to explain them to us. Now, this is always a shock to people. Now, he's Japanese American, but he happens to also be a Jew. Now, that's interesting. But he mentioned something very interesting. He said that all of his research, in fact, excuse me here, thanks to one of these wonderful things that God's given us, we're able to do. He talks about his faith. And he mentions, he said, life on earth is not the result of some random accident, where all the right factors happen to create life, but of an intelligent, loving God who created us and created the perfect environment for us to live in. More and more physicists and scientists come to believe this and see the universe as proof of the Creator. Look at Psalm number 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, the sky proclaims the builder's craft. One day to the next conveys that message. One night to the next imparts that knowledge. There is no word or sound, no voice is heard, yet their report goes forth through all the earth, their message to the ends of the world. Just looking at the universe itself, it has a language, not a voice that we can hear, but something else. And of course, for Dr. Kaku, one of those languages, of course, is mathematics. But there's something else that he mentions here. And let me get back up to it. Let's see. He talks about his life, and he says the following. As a child, and get ready for what he's going to say. Remember how I mentioned Scripture is a place where you meet someone? Not read about someone, but encounter. Now remember, he's a practicing Jew. Speaking on his faith, he said, as a child, I received instruction both in the Bible and in the Talmud. I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene. No one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates in every word. So even the Gospels, I've spent most of the time on the Old Testament, I mentioned last week, because for too many of us Christians, the Old Testament is becoming further and further removed from us. We're not accessing it the way St. Paul and Peter could. And so recapturing what we've lost is important. But imagine that idea. So even the Gospels, we're not reading reports about Jesus. This isn't USA Today, okay? This is something else. A place of encounter. Even he talks about it pulsates with a personality. I go back to John chapter 5, the last verse. Moses wrote about me. See, there's more to prophecy than being a prophet like Hosea or Isaiah, especially Isaiah, because at Christmas time we always read about him, correct? We've forgotten how even the book of Exodus is a prophecy of the incarnation. Moses wrote about me. The very personality of Christ is in the Old Covenant also. Now, I mentioned scientists. There's another person who's very interesting also. I follow his lectures. He's only 37 years old. His name is Jeremy England. And Jeremy England has explored how can life begin. And some think he's standing evolutionary theory on its head. And this guy is so amazing. He has his own institute at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's called the England Project, England Institute. Well, interesting enough, Jeremy's father was a non-practicing Christian. His mother is a Jew, and she was the child of teenage survivors from the Holocaust. She was from Poland. Well, when he was working on his doctorates and he was at Oxford, he rediscovered his faith root. He's Orthodox Jew. And in one of his interviews, and you can find it on YouTube yourself, he said the following. People always ask me, how is it that I can be a scientist and I believe in God and the scripture? And he says, the only people who ask questions like that have a problem. Number one, they don't really know what science is. And number two, they really don't know what scripture is either. And so, and he pointed out something about, remember I talked about expanding our awareness? Pope Benedict and likewise St. John Paul II talked about scientism too often as a narrow our perception. Faith expands our perception. And the Dr. England quoted a famous English philosopher who happened to be born in Austria in 1887, Ludwig Wittgenstein. He's a logical positivist. And he even had to make this comment. And I'm going to risk saying it in German. Die Grenze meiner Sprache bedeuten die Grenze meiner Welt. The limits of my language define the limits of my world. The limits of my language define the limits of my world. And so he pointed something out. In an op-ed about half a year ago in the Wall Street Journal, he wanted to raise a comment, if not a denunciation, of a certain author that tried to use his name in a book. Talk about him almost doing the opposite of what his research is. And he said the following about science and scripture. He said, and he quotes that passage, the limits of my language define the limits of my world. He said, physics is a language, but it's limited. Biology is another language, but it's limited. Physics doesn't care about something being alive or not. It makes no difference if you drop a rock from a roof to calculate momentum or a mouse. And then he said the following. Physics does a great job explaining to you how you can get from New York to Chicago. Stay up in the air. But physics can't give you a language to express the exhilaration of being above the clouds and looking at Earth that you could never begin to grasp from a man. Biomedical technology is wonderful for telling us how human conception takes place, correct? But its language is limited in terms of why do people fall in love? Why do they make a commitment to each other? You need another language for that relationship. And so too it is with Scripture. It's got a different type of a language. It is the language of relationship, the language of an encounter, the language of a love that sees a face of God, a language that can give you, as Dr. Kaku said, a personality pulsates through it. And so, when we gathered here together next week, we're going to explore now in the New Testament that personality of Jesus Christ. Thank you all very much.